Today we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court because I believe it will be one of the most consequential outcomes of the 2024 election. Because if Donald Trump is able to get reelected, he will be able to appoint 2 more justices. This means that a man that has never won the popular vote would have appointed 5 out of the 9 justices on our Supreme Court. And we know this would be devastating, considering the current court is already leaving future generations of women with fewer rights than their mothers had. They're rolling back voting right protections, making it harder for minorities to vote. And they're also creating a world where freedom from religion is tantamount to oppressing Christians. So today we're going to look at a couple of these devastating decisions and look at just how far right this current court has gone. And we'll start things off looking at Roe v. Wade.
At the Supreme Court today, an historic upheaval. In a sweeping ruling that overturned a half a century of precedents, 5 justices ended the right of American women to choose abortion under the Constitution. The court upheld Mississippi's ban on abortions after 15 weeks by a 6-3 vote, and 5 of those justices went even farther, voting to overturn Roe v. Wade itself.
I know there has been conservative activism around this issue for more than 50 years, but the Supreme Court really wasted no time at all before making this decision. As soon as they had their supermajority, poof, Roe was gone. And there's been huge consequences of this decision all over the country. Women are being life-flighted out of their states because they can't get the care they need. We have women bleeding out on the bathroom floor or even going into sepsis before a doctor feels comfortable taking them on as a patient. And we even have 13-year-old rape victims who are being forced to carry these pregnancies to term. It's absolutely disgusting. When I think about America, I think about expanding our rights and expanding our freedoms. But this court seems hell-bent on taking them away. And this isn't just limited to abortion either. They're going after the Voting Rights Act as well.
With states across the country passing new laws that make voting more difficult, especially for minorities, the Supreme Court today gave a green light. By a 6-3 vote, the conservative majority on the court upheld 2 election laws in Arizona. One criminalizes the collection of ballots by third parties, dubbed ballot harvesting by critics. The other requires election officials to throw out ballots cast at the wrong precinct. Voting rights activists offered evidence that these laws impact Native Americans and other minorities more than whites in Arizona and claimed they violated the Voting Rights Act. But in today's ruling, Justice Samuel Alito, writing for the court, brushed that evidence aside, saying the burden on minority voters was minor. Mere inconvenience cannot be enough to justify a violation of the Voting Rights Act, Alito wrote. In an impassioned dissent, Justice Elena Kagan, writing for the court's liberals, declared, "What is tragic is that the court has damaged the statute designed to bring about the end of discrimination in voting."
So basically what the court is saying here is that unless you drop off your own ballot, you're out of luck. And of course, this is going to affect minorities at higher rates. The Voting Rights Act was supposed to protect against this kind of discrimination, but now it's just a shell of what it used to be. And that's not the only legislation they've taken an axe to. They're starting to ignore the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment as well.
The ruling is a victory for Amy Carson, who lives with her husband in Maine. They sent their daughter to the same religious high school they attended, Bangor Christian. They say it teaches values that are important in their lives.
It's an extension of how we raise her at the house. The beliefs that the school has are in line with what we have at the home.
But because that school provides an explicitly religious education, the Carsons were not eligible to receive tuition money from the state. Maine gives taxpayer money to families who live in areas that don't have public high schools. But the state bans using that public money to send children to schools that offer religious instruction, saying it wants to avoid subsidizing religion. Today, by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court said that's religious discrimination. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts said Maine promotes stricter separation of church and state than the federal Constitution requires.
The First Amendment has the Establishment Clause, and that clause says that the government is prohibited from making any law respecting an establishment of religion. But this conservative court seems to have forgotten about the Establishment Clause altogether, and is instead weaponizing the freedom of religion portion of the First Amendment. They're basically saying that my tax dollars must be used to fund religious indoctrination. Otherwise, I'm discriminating against those religions. And these aren't the only examples of the rightward shift of the court. And that's exactly what we're seeing. They're basically legislating a right-wing agenda from the bench. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like.
The abortion ruling is the most dramatic example of how far and how fast the conservative supermajority moved the court to the right. It didn't just uphold Mississippi's law banning abortion after 15 weeks, it also overturned the constitutional right to abortion. It didn't only strike down New York's law requiring a special need for a concealed carry permit, it said all gun regulations must have historic roots. It didn't just restrict the EPA, it said Congress has to explicitly let federal agencies take major actions. And it reduced the separation of church and state, ruling that taxpayer money can be used at schools that offer an explicitly religious education, and ruling for a football coach who led prayers on the 50-yard line immediately after games.
There are 6 relatively young Supreme Court justices who feel incredibly emboldened, incredibly aggressive to move American law to the right, and they are not stopping with this.
So I think most of us probably knew that the Supreme Court was going to be pretty bad after Trump was able to appoint 3 justices. And maybe it was just me that didn't expect such a seismic shift to the right. But this court isn't just leaning conservative. They seem emboldened to implement a far-right agenda. And I came across this really good article from Nina Totenberg in NPR from July 2022. And she tried to quantify some of this rightward shift. The piece was called "The Supreme Court is the Most Conservative in 90 Years." And here's what she found. She said that the last time the court was this conservative was in 1931. She found that conservatives prevailed 62% of the time, and even 59% of the close decisions went conservative as well. And they didn't just prevail, they prevailed in dramatic ways. It's kind of like that tectonic shift that I'm referring to. She also found that there's been more 6-3 decisions than any other time in modern history, and that liberal justices are dissenting more than any other times in their careers. And lastly, there have been fewer unanimous decisions among this Supreme Court. So if you take all of this together, it kind of shows how far right this court has gone. And I think Leah Littman, the host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, did a really good job of pointing this out.
It's just a staggering number of cases to begin with that they took on of huge national import, and it's not July yet, it's June 14th. I mean, they are going to dump these opinions on the American public and the American press, you know, in a way that threatens to overwhelm anybody's ability to make sense of them.
I think that's correct. And this is in some ways the new normal. The court is taking on a smaller number of cases, but a larger number of these huge, high profile, ideologically significant cases that could remake American government, and then loading up those decisions at the end of the term so that people are, as you suggest, just overwhelmed. I mean, last term, in a single week, we were getting affirmative action decisions on West Virginia versus EPA, the Future of Clean Power Plan, also the case about LGBTQ equality and whether laws guaranteeing LGBTQ equality could be enforced in all circumstances. The term before that, it was about the future of gun control in Bruin, coupled with Dobbs, the court overruling Roe. Those decisions came back to back. And so the court is loading up these decisions, taking on smaller number of cases, but also bigger, more significant cases, and I think attempting to skirt the public radar.
So I think if we just look at the policy level alone, we can see that this court is making huge decisions that is having wide-ranging impacts all across this country. They're basically rewriting the rule book. And I think that's why it's so important, if for nothing else, we have to vote for the future of the Supreme Court in 2024. And I think Dan Pfeiffer put it pretty perfectly when he was laying out the stakes of this election. Dan Pfeiffer is a senior political advisor to Obama and host of the Pod Save America podcast.
And think about the stakes of the Supreme Court. If Donald Trump wins, he will almost certainly get 2 more appointments. By the end of Trump's term, second term were he to win, Thomas will be 82, Alito will be 78.
They're definitely retiring.
They're definitely retiring.
If Trump wins again.
And it could be just KBJ, like holding down the fort.
And Justice Sotomayor will be 72 at the end of Trump's term. So he will definitely get 2 appointments. If he has 2 appointments, that means he will have appointed 5 Supreme Court justices, all of whom will be around or below the age of 60 when he leaves office. That is a court majority, a MAGA court majority that will rule for decades. We can win the next however many presidential elections, and absent something sort of extraordinary happening, Trump's fingerprints will be all over the Supreme Court.
I think he did a pretty good job of laying things out there. So if you get anything out of this video, please just remember what the stakes are in 2024. This court has taken a hard right turn, and they're making huge changes at breakneck speeds. And aside from court reform, the only other tool at our disposal right now is voting. And I think that's why it's so important that we get out there and vote for Biden in November. We have to make sure that Trump doesn't have the opportunity to appoint more than half of our Supreme Court. I think it would be devastating. We could be looking at a far-right conservative court up until 2040, 2050. I mean, we have to take this seriously. So don't forget to vote in November, guys. But that's going to do it for me on this one, folks. If you got anything out of this video, please remember to smash that like button and hit subscribe. Please share with a friend or two. I'd very much appreciate that. If you think I got something wrong, or if you disagree with me about something, let's hash it out in the comments below. And if you want to understand why I think Trump is just a wannabe mob boss, go ahead and watch that video on the screen now. And I will see you guys on the next one.